The rusted chains of the swing set groaned a mournful song, each creak echoing the hollowness in Mia's chest. The Westlake Academy playground, a supposed haven of childhood joy, felt more like a battleground. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, glinted off the polished chrome of the slide, a stark contrast to the shadows that clung to the edges of her vision. She pushed off the ground, her small legs pumping, trying to find a rhythm, a solace in the repetitive motion. But the whispers, like insidious tendrils, always found their way in. Underscore their staring again. Underscore the thought, a constant companion, tightened the knot in her stomach. She could feel their eyes, sharp and dissecting, boring in her back. Underscore, why do they always stare? Underscore, she didn't understand. She hadn't done anything. She just wanted to be left alone, to disappear into the rhythm of the swing, to become invisible against the backdrop of boisterous laughter and carefree shrieks. Still playing by yourself, huh? The voice, laced with mock sympathy, sliced through the air. Mia esse swing gestilet. Her breath hitched. She knew that voice. She knew the predatory gleam that accompanied it. Ethan Carter, his shadow, fell over her, blocking the meager warmth of the late autumn sun. A shiver, unrelated to the chill in the air, ran down her spine. Underscore, don't look at him. Don't engage. Maybe he'll go away. Underscore, it was a mantra she repeated endlessly, a fragile shield against the relentless onslaught of his taunts. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. That's kind of sad. Maybe no one wants to play with you. Or maybe they just don't like. He let the sentence hang, unfinished, a cruel ellipsis that filled the silence with unspoken insults. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, her small hands gripping the chains of the swing until her knuckles turned white. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the telltale sign of the shame that burned within her. Underscore, why? Why me? Underscore, the question echoed in her mind, a silent scream against the injustice of it all. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense of isolation that was as palpable as the cold metal of the swing beneath her fingers. Leave her alone, Ethan. A voice, clear and strong, cut through the tension. Mia opened her eyes, surprised. It was Samantha, a girl from her class. Not a friend, not really, but someone who, unlike the others, seemed to see her, to acknowledge her existence in this hostile landscape. Ethan straightened up, his face contorted in a sneer. He turned his attention to Samantha, his eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with disdain. What's it to you, Samantha? Sticking up for the little loser? He took a step towards her, his posture radiating an almost physical threat. A group of his friends, their faces mirroring his cruel amusement, gathered around. Mia watched, her heart pounding against her ribs, a familiar dread creeping into her veins. Underscore, he's going to hurt her. He's going to hurt me. Underscore, the playground, once a place of imagined freedom, now felt like a cage, the laughter and shouts of the other children a distorted soundtrack to her growing fear. She's not a loser, Samantha retorted, her voice trembling slightly, but holding its ground. And you need to back off. Ethan let out a harsh laugh. Or what? He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. What are you going to do about it? The air crackled with unspoken menace. Mia wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But her legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. She was trapped, a silent witness to this unfolding drama, her own fear a suffocating blanket. He turned back to Mia, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. You don't belong here. He shoved her hard. The force of it sent her flying backwards, the swing arcing violently. She landed hard on the ground, the air knocked out of her lungs. A sharp pain shot through her elbow, a burning sensation that quickly spread through her arm. She lay there for a moment, stunned, the world tilting on its axis. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already hazy playground scene. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the humiliation, the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of his actions that cut her to the core. This time, the tears weren't just from the sting of the fall, or the throbbing in her elbow. This time, they were tears of a different kind. Tears of realization. Tears that finally broke through the wall of silence she had built around herself. She had tried to be invisible. She had tried to endure, but it wasn't working. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that she was okay, that she could handle this alone. She needed help. The thought, raw and terrifying, pierced through the fog of her fear. I need help. Was a whisper at first, then a desperate plea echoing in the hollow chambers of her heart. She pushed herself up, her scraped knees stinging, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked around, her eyes searching, seeking a lifeline in this sea of indifference. And then she saw him, her father, standing at the edge of the playground, his face a mask of controlled fury. The fluorescent lights of the Westlake Academy cafeteria hummed, a dull, monotonous soundtrack to the lunchtime cacophony. The air, thick with a mingled sense of lukewarm pizza and overripe bananas, hung heavy and stagnant. Mia Adams sat alone at a table tucked away in a corner, a small island of quiet in the boisterous sea of students. She meticulously separated the kernels of corn from her mixed vegetables, a ritual she performed with unwavering focus, a small act of control in a world that often felt overwhelmingly chaotic. Just eat, she told herself. Don't look up, don't make eye contact. The plastic fork felt cold and slick in her hand. She pushed the food around her plate, the vibrant colors blurring into an indistinguishable mess. Why did Mom pack this? I hate corn. A shadow fell across her table, and a chill, colder than the plastic fork, snaked down her spine. She knew, without looking up, who it was. Well. Ethan Carter drawled, his voice dripping with a mocking sweetness that made Mia's stomach clench. He leaned closer, his shadow engulfing her. Look who it is. Little Miss Lonely. His cronies, two boys whose names Mia struggled to recall, snickered in the background, their faces blurred in her peripheral vision. Mia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Ignore him. Just ignore him. He'll go away. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, her fingers tightening around the plastic fork until her knuckles whitened. The silence stretched, taut with unspoken hostility, broken only by the clatter of trays and the muffled chatter of other students. Ethan shifted his weight, the movement radiating a predatory tension that made Mia's breath catch in her throat. He nudged her table with his knee, a jarring jolt that sent her carefully separated vegetables scattering across the table. And then, with a feigned clumsiness that was as transparent as it was cruel, he accidentally knocked her lunch tray to the floor with a loud clatter. The plastic container split open, spilling its contents: the hated corn, the soggy mixed vegetables, the half-eaten sandwich onto the linoleum. A ripple of laughter spread from Ethan's group, echoing in the sudden, shocked silence of the surrounding tables. Mia's face burned with shame. The familiar wave of helplessness washed over her, threatening to drown her in its icy grip. Her eyes stung with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent scream echoing in her mind. Why? Why does he do this? A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to bubble up within her, a mixture of anger and resentment that she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. It was a small spark, but it burned with an intensity that surprised her. Ethan, basking in the attention, feigned surprise. Oops, he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. Guess that was an accident. He smirked, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He expected tears, the usual silent retreat, the same predictable response that fueled his cruel game. He savored the moment, the power he held over her, the fear that radiated from her small frame. He reveled in the silence, the anticipation of her inevitable surrender. But today, something was different. Mia opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his directly. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by something new, something hard and unyielding. She drew a shaky breath, the air catching in her throat, and then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet somehow carried over the din of the cafeteria, she spoke. You're pathetic, she said, the words raw, unfiltered, laced with a contempt that surprised even herself. The word hung in the air, a stark contrast to the usual hushed fear. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His cronies stopped laughing, their faces contorted in a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. Mia held his gaze, her small frame trembling, but her eyes unwavering. The spark of anger within her flared, fueled by years of suppressed resentment, of silent tears swallowed in the darkness of her room. Inside, a whirlwind of emotions raged. Fear warred with anger, shame battled with defiance. Did I really say that? He's going to hurt me. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else ignited a fragile sense of empowerment, a nascent understanding that silence wasn't her only weapon. The carefully constructed walls of self-preservation, built brick by brick over years of relentless bullying, began to crumble, revealing a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She watched Ethan's face, searching for a reaction, bracing herself for the inevitable retaliation. But the expected explosion of anger didn't come. Instead, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features, a brief glimpse of vulnerability that she had never seen before. He really looked at her for the first time, and in that moment he seemed to see not the quiet, timid girl he had tormented for so long, but something else, something unknown, something that made him hesitate. The hum of the cafeteria, a chaotic symphony of clanging trays and childish chatter, pressed against Mia's ears. She'd retreated to the far corner, a self-imposed exile. Each bite of the tasteless sandwich felt like ash in her mouth. Samantha's words, her unexpected defense, echoed in Mia's mind, a fragile shield against the gnawing fear. But the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. Ethan's eyes, dark and furious, had burned into her, a promise of retribution. She could feel his gaze, even now, a tangible weight on her back. He won't let this go, she thought, the words a chilling whisper in the hollow of her mind. He never does. She picked at her food, appetite gone, each nerve ending screaming with a hyper-awareness of her surroundings. Across the room, Ethan Carter seethed. His face, normally flushed with an arrogant confidence, was now contorted with rage. Samantha's interference, her public challenge to his authority, had struck a deep blow to his carefully constructed image. How dare she, he thought, the words a venomous mantra in his mind. How dare she question me, in front of everyone? He felt a burning shame, a humiliating exposure he couldn't bear. He balled his fists, the plastic fork in his hand snapping with the force of his grip. He glanced towards Mia, shrinking in the corner, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. He wouldn't let this stand. He wouldn't be humiliated. He'd make her pay. He rose from his table, his movements deliberate, each step fueled by a simmering anger. The noise of the cafeteria faded, replaced by the rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat in his ears. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. Mia Adams, huddled and vulnerable. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes as he approached, a spark of satisfaction igniting within him. This is what you deserve, he thought, his inner voice a cold, hard whisper. This is what happens when you defy me. Mia saw him coming. The casual swagger, the predatory gleam in his eyes, sent a jolt of terror through her. She wanted to run, to disappear, to melt into the linoleum floor. But her limbs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. She braced herself, her small hands clenching into fists, a futile gesture of defiance against the inevitable. Please, just leave me alone, she pleaded silently, a desperate prayer echoing in the confines of her fear. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. The air crackled with unspoken animosity. For a moment, they stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the chaotic energy of the cafeteria swirling around them. Then, with a swift, brutal shove, he pushed her. The force of it sent her sprawling backwards, her tray clattering to the floor, food scattering across the linoleum. A collective gasp rippled through the cafeteria, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of her small body hitting the ground. The pain shot through Mia's arm as she landed, a sharp, stinging sensation that stole her breath. Humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain. She lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, the world spinning around her. Tears welled in her eyes, not from the pain, but from the crushing weight of injustice. Why? She thought, the question a silent scream in her mind. Why does he hate me so much? Samantha, witnessing the scene unfold, felt a surge of righteous anger. She'd hoped her earlier intervention would be enough, a deterrent to further aggression. But she'd underestimated Ethan's cruelty, his insatiable need to dominate and control. She pushed her way through the gathering crowd, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "What is wrong with you?" Ethan, momentarily stunned by his own actions, turned to face her, his eyes blazing with defiance. He opened his mouth to retort, to unleash the torrent of anger and frustration churning within him, but the words caught in his throat. He saw the disgust in Samantha's eyes, the disapproval etched on the faces of the other students, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. He had gone too far. He had crossed the line. Mr. Donovan, the vice principal, emerged from the throng of students, his expression grim. He'd been alerted by the sudden hush that had fallen over the cafeteria, a silence pregnant with tension. He took in the scene before him. Mia sprawled on the floor, scattered food, and Ethan standing over her, a mixture of defiance and fear in his eyes. "Ethan Carter," Mr. Donovan's voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. "Principal's office." Now, the words hung in the air, heavy with authority. Ethan flinched, the bravado draining from his face, replaced by a dawning realization of the consequences. He looked down at Mia, still huddled on the floor, and a wave of shame washed over him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene, to challenge his power. He mumbled a sullen apology, his voice barely audible, before turning and walking towards the exit, the weight of Mr. Donovan's gaze heavy on his back. As Ethan disappeared from view, Mr. Donovan knelt beside Mia, his face softening with concern. He extended a hand, helping her to her feet. He examined her arm, his touch gentle, and asked if she was all right. Mia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Someone had finally seen her. Someone had finally acknowledged the relentless torment she'd endured. Mr. Donovan's intervention, his unwavering condemnation of Ethan's actions, was a small but significant victory. It was a crack in the wall of indifference that had shielded Ethan for so long, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness of Westlake Academy. The hum of the car engine was a low, steady thrum against the silence. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the familiar streets in hues of amber and rose. Inside, the air hung heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. Mia sat in the back, small and quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The rhythm of the car, the gentle sway, did little to soothe the tremor that ran beneath her skin. She watched the world blur past, each house, each tree, a fleeting image in the panorama of her unease. "Don't say anything. Don't say anything." The words repeated in her mind, a mantra against the rising tide of fear. Fear not of what had happened, but of what might happen if she spoke. Her father, Jonathan, sat at the wheel, his hands steady on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The set of his jaw, the subtle clench of his fingers spoke volumes. He was a man who carried his power quietly, a stillness that often preceded the storm. Beside him, Jessica, Mia's mother, stole glances at her daughter in the rearview mirror. Her eyes, usually bright and warm, held a shadow of concern. The silence in the car was a fragile thing, stretched taut like a wire about to snap. Mia felt the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could feel her mother's unspoken question hanging in the air, a tangible presence in the confined space. They know something's wrong. They always know. Mia shifted in her seat, the slight rustle of her clothes breaking the oppressive quiet. Her fingers traced the rough fabric of her skirt, a nervous habit she couldn't seem to break. She looked down at her scraped elbows, the raw skin a stark contrast against the dark fabric. Small wounds, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet they held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It's nothing, just a fall. The lie formed in her mind, a shield against the inevitable questions. Yet, even as she thought it, she knew it wouldn't hold. Her parents, with their uncanny ability to see beneath the surface, would know. They always did. Jessica's voice, soft yet laced with a subtle edge, finally broke the silence. "Mia, honey, are you all right? You seem quiet." The question hung in the air, a delicate probe into the fortress Mia had built around herself. Mia hesitated, the lie poised on her lips. She wanted to say yes, to brush it off, to pretend everything was normal. But the lump in her throat, the tightness in her chest, made it impossible. She looked down at her scraped elbows, the raw skin a stark reminder of what had happened. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her arms, presenting them as silent testimony. "It was Ethan," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The words, once uttered, seemed to hang in the air, heavy and charged with unspoken meaning. Jessica's intake of breath was sharp, a sudden crack in the composed facade she maintained. Her eyes, reflected in the rearview mirror, widened with alarm. Who did this? Her voice, though soft, held a tremor of anger. Jonathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. He didn't speak, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. The air in the car crackled with a new kind of silence, one charged with anticipation and unspoken questions. Mia shrank back against the seat, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of her own words. "I shouldn't have said anything." Regret gnawed at her, a familiar companion. She had broken the fragile peace, shattered the illusion of normalcy. And now, the consequences, whatever they may be, were about to unfold. The rest of the drive home was a blur. Mia barely registered the familiar streets, the houses passing by in a silent procession. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: fear, regret, a flicker of hope. She had spoken, finally broken the silence. And though she didn't know what would happen next, a small part of her felt a sense of relief. The burden she had carried, the secret she had guarded so fiercely, was finally out in the open. Jonathan pulled the car into the driveway, the engine sighing to a stop. The silence returned, but it was different now. No longer heavy and oppressive, but charged with a sense of purpose. He turned to Mia, his gaze intense, searching. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice low and steady. And for the first time since it happened, Mia felt a glimmer of hope. She was no longer alone. Her father, her protector, was here, and he would make things right. The tears she had held back for so long finally welled up, blurring her vision. But they weren't tears of fear or sadness, but of something else entirely. Perhaps a small, fragile seed of hope, finally taking root in the barren landscape of her fear. The story, she knew, was far from over. But for the first time, Mia felt a flicker of something akin to strength, a nascent understanding that even in the darkest of times, there was a possibility of light. The aroma of rosemary and garlic drifted from the kitchen, a familiar comfort that did little to soothe the tremor in Mia's small hands. She sat at the dining table, picking at the edge of a placemat, the vibrant colors blurring into an indistinct swirl. Her gaze was fixed on the swirling patterns, a desperate focal point in a world suddenly tilting on its axis. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick an echoing hammer against the fragile wall of her composure. Her parents were in the kitchen, their hushed voices a low murmur she couldn't quite decipher. Yet every inflection, every pause, resonated with the unspoken tension that had settled over their home like a suffocating fog. Mia's stomach churned, a cold knot of dread tightening with each passing second. She knew they were talking about her, about it. The incident. The word itself felt too small, too insignificant to contain the torrent of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her: shame, fear, a burning ember of anger banked beneath layers of ingrained passivity. Her mother, Jessica, entered the dining room, her face etched with a concern that mirrored Mia's own inner turmoil. She knelt beside Mia, her hand gentle on her daughter's shoulder. "Dinner will be ready soon, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft, yet laced with an undercurrent of steel that Mia recognized as her mother's protective instinct rising to the surface. Mia nodded, unable to meet her mother's gaze. The weight of the unspoken truth pressed down on her, a suffocating burden she could no longer bear alone. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock, "Dada needs to know." The words tumbled out, raw and ragged, each syllable a small victory against the fear that had kept her silent for so long. Jessica's hand tightened on her shoulder. "I know, honey. He will. Just tell him everything." There was a flicker of something else in her mother's eyes, a steely glint that sent a shiver down Mia's spine. It wasn't just concern. It was something colder, sharper. Anger. Jonathan Adams entered the room, his presence filling the space with a quiet authority that always seemed to settle the air around him. He sat opposite Mia, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, until finally he spoke. "Tell me what happened, Mia." His voice was calm, even, yet beneath the surface, Mia sensed a tightly coiled tension, a predator's stillness before the strike. The words came in a rush, a torrent of suppressed emotions finally breaking free. She recounted every detail, every taunt, every shove, every whispered insult that had chipped away at her confidence, leaving her feeling small and insignificant. She described the way Ethan's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction, the smirk that twisted his lips as he relished his power over her. She spoke of the recess incident, the sudden explosion of violence, the sharp sting of pain as she fell to the ground, the jeering laughter of the other children ringing in her ears. As she spoke, the tears she had held back for so long finally flowed, hot and heavy, blurring her vision. Jonathan listened, his face a mask of controlled fury. His hands, resting on the table, clenched into fists, the knuckles white against his dark skin. The muscles in his jaw twitched, a barely perceptible tremor that betrayed the storm raging within. Mia watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of fear and a strange sense of relief washing over her. He knew. Finally, he knew. When she finished, the silence returned, heavier, more oppressive than before. The scent of rosemary and garlic, once comforting, now seemed to hang in the air like a bitter accusation. Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on Mia, his eyes dark and unreadable. The ticking of the clock seemed to amplify the silence, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile peace of the room. Jessica moved to stand beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm, a silent gesture of support, a shared understanding that transcended words. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the unspoken promise of retribution hanging heavy in the air. Jonathan drew a deep breath, the sound sharp and ragged in the quiet room. He looked at Mia, his eyes softening, the anger receding, replaced by a profound sadness. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, reassuring, a silent promise of protection. "I'm so sorry, Mia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have known. I should have protected you." Mia squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, her own heart aching with the weight of his words. She knew he hadn't failed her. She had failed herself by remaining silent for so long, by allowing the fear to paralyze her. Jonathan straightened, his gaze hardening, the sadness replaced by a steely resolve. He looked at Jessica, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding of what needed to be done. He turned back to Mia, his voice low and steady. "No one," he said, each word weighted with meaning, "will ever hurt you like this again. I'll handle it." The words hung in the air, a promise, a threat, a declaration of war. In that moment, Mia knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her bones, that everything would change. The fear that had held her captive for so long began to recede, replaced by a flicker of hope, a nascent sense of empowerment. Her father would handle it, and she believed him. The rosemary and garlic still permeated the air, but now, mingled with the scent of something else, something sharper, more potent. The scent of justice. The opulent mahogany table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the tension that hung heavy in the air like a shroud. Jonathan Adams sat ramrod straight, his presence filling the room despite his stillness. Flanking him were two lawyers, their faces impassive, their briefcases strategically placed at their feet like silent sentinels. Across the table, Principal Reynolds fidgeted, his usual veneer of polished composure cracked, revealing a flicker of unease in his eyes. Beside him, William and Catherine Carter exuded an air of bewildered indignation, their faces tight with a mixture of disbelief and nascent fear. Ethan sat between them, his usual swagger replaced with a hunched posture, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns in the Persian rug. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning, each tick of the unseen clock amplifying the unspoken accusations. Jonathan's mind raced, a storm of fury and protectiveness warring within him. He saw Mia's tear-streaked face, felt the phantom ache of her bruised arm, and the memory stoked the embers of his anger. "This isn't a game, Reynolds. This is my daughter's life. My daughter was assaulted in your school." Jonathan's voice sliced through the silence, each word precise and weighted with barely controlled fury. He watched Reynolds flinch, the subtle tell a small victory in the battle he was waging. He knew, and he did nothing. You knew about the bullying, you did nothing. That ends today. His gaze swept across the Carters, lingering on Ethan, whose head remained bowed. A child. He's just a child, but he needs to understand actions have consequences. Jonathan fought the urge to rise, to cross the room and confront the boy directly. He needed to maintain control, to channel his anger into action, not outburst. Catherine Carter shifted uncomfortably, the expensive fabric of her dress rustling in the quiet. "This is all a misunderstanding," she began, her voice laced with a dismissive tone that grated on Jonathan's nerves. He saw it then, the ingrained denial, the privileged blindness that allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. "Misunderstanding? My daughter was cornered, physically attacked. There's no misunderstanding here." He felt his jaw clench, the muscles tightening. His lawyers remained impassive, their stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within him. He knew they were observing, assessing, preparing their strategy. But this wasn't just a legal battle. This was a fight for his daughter's safety and well-being. "Your son assaulted my daughter," Jonathan stated, his voice low and dangerous. He leaned forward, the movement subtle but conveying an unmistakable sense of menace. "This isn't teasing. This is a pattern this school has enabled." He could feel the weight of their gazes, the shift in the atmosphere as the flimsy facade of polite discourse crumbled. Reynolds cleared his throat, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jonathan cut him off. "Don't insult me with platitudes, Reynolds. I've seen the reports, the complaints from other parents. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a culture of disregard, a breeding ground for this kind of behavior." William Carter finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Now, see here, Mr. Adams. Ethan may have been a bit rough. Boys will be boys after all, but—" Jonathan cut him off again, his voice rising. "Boys will be boys. Is it your defense for physical assault? Your son terrorized my daughter, made her life a living hell, and your response is boys will be boys." He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the familiar surge of adrenaline that threatened to overwhelm his composure. "Breathe, Jonathan, breathe." The two lawyers flanking him remained stoic, their faces masks of professional detachment. He knew they were waiting for his signal, ready to unleash the legal machinery they had at their disposal. But he wanted Reynolds to understand the gravity of the situation, the profound impact of his inaction. He wanted the Carters to see the pain their son had inflicted, the fear he had instilled in his daughter. He wanted them to acknowledge their complicity, their failure to protect not only their own son from the consequences of his actions, but also the other children who had suffered at his hands. Ethan will be suspended, effective immediately, Reynolds finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked from Jonathan to the Carters, his gaze darting nervously between them. And then we will be conducting a thorough investigation into these allegations. Jonathan watched him, searching for any sign of genuine remorse, any indication that he understood the depth of his failure. He saw none. This isn't enough. Suspension isn't enough, Jonathan stated flatly. This isn't just about Ethan. It's about the environment that allowed this to happen, the systemic negligence that has put my daughter and other children at risk. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. My lawyers will be in touch. This isn't over. The meeting ended abruptly, the tension lingering in the air like the aftermath of a storm. As Jonathan left the office, flanked by his legal team, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. This wasn't victory. This was just the beginning. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew he wouldn't rest until Mia felt safe, until the school acknowledged its failings, and until those responsible were held accountable. He glanced back at the closed door of the principal's office, the polished mahogany surface reflecting his own grim determination. This is for you, Mia. The plush leather of the principal's office chair felt cold and unyielding beneath Ethan. He shifted uncomfortably, the starched fabric of his uniform shirt scratching against his skin. The silence in the room was thick, heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Each tick seemed to reverberate in his chest, a constant, dull throb of anxiety. He snuck a glance at his parents. His mother, Catherine, sat ramrod straight, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, her gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the polished mahogany desk. His father, William, drummed his fingers on the armrest of his chair, a barely contained impatience radiating from him. Ethan knew that look. It was the look that preceded a lecture, a carefully worded reprimand delivered in the measured tones of a man who rarely raised his voice, but whose words carried the weight of his considerable influence. Ethan wished, not for the first time that afternoon, that the ground would swallow him whole. He'd sat through countless lectures from his parents before, sermons on etiquette and decorum, on the importance of maintaining the Carter family name. But this time, the shame was different. It clung to him, a sticky, suffocating film. Principal Reynolds, his face a mask of professional concern, cleared his throat. After careful consideration of the incident, and in consultation with Mr. and Mrs. Adams, he began, his voice smooth, practiced, "We have decided that a suspension is warranted." Ethan's stomach lurched. Suspension. The word echoed in his ears, a stark, undeniable consequence. He hadn't thought it would actually happen. Not to him. He'd pushed other kids around before, smaller kids, quieter kids. There had been whispers, disapproving glances from teachers, the occasional stern talking to. But nothing like this. Nothing that threatened the carefully constructed facade of Ethan Carter, star student, promising athlete, son of William and Catherine Carter. His internal monologue was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, a cold, creeping dread, coiled in his gut. Confusion, a disorienting sense of injustice, warred with a nascent flicker of something else, something unfamiliar. Guilt. He risked another glance at his parents. His mother's expression hadn't changed. His father's jaw was clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Ethan could feel their disappointment, sharp and pointed, like shards of glass. He let them down. He tarnished their perfect image. The thought twisted in his gut, a sickening blend of shame and regret. He'd always craved their approval, their praise. He'd pushed himself to excel, to be the best, not for himself, but for them. And now all of that was threatened. Furthermore, Principal Reynolds continued, his voice cutting through Ethan's spiraling thoughts. After Ethan's suspension, he will be required to attend counseling sessions with a child psychologist. This is non-negotiable. We must address the root cause of this behavior and ensure such an incident never occurs again. Counseling. Another blow to his carefully constructed image. He could almost hear the whispers already, the speculation, the judgment. He'd become the problem child, the troubled kid. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the rising tide of panic. Mr. Adams, Mia's father, spoke then, his voice low and steady, a quiet power radiating from him. "Think about the person you want to become, Ethan," he said, his words aimed directly at the boy, piercing through the layers of denial and bravado. "Because right now you're not him." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ethan opened his eyes, meeting Mr. Adams' gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound sadness, a disappointment that cut deeper than any reprimand. And in that moment, something shifted inside Ethan. The fear remained, but the confusion began to dissipate, replaced by a dawning realization. He'd hurt someone. He'd caused pain, real pain, to a girl who hadn't done anything to deserve it. The image of Mia, small and vulnerable, her face streaked with tears, flashed in his mind. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she'd flinched when he'd raised his hand. He hadn't thought about it before, hadn't considered her feelings, her pain. He'd been too caught up in his own need for control, his own twisted sense of power. The silence stretched, broken only by the relentless ticking of the clock. Ethan felt a strange pressure building in his chest, a tightness that constricted his breathing. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing larger. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over him, drowning out any coherent thought. He'd been wrong, terribly, horribly wrong, and for the first time, he understood the true weight of his actions. Principal Reynolds concluded the meeting, outlining the details of Ethan's suspension and the mandatory counseling sessions. He emphasized the school's zero-tolerance policy for bullying and warned that any further incidents would result in expulsion. As his parents ushered him out of the office, Ethan didn't meet their eyes. He felt their disappointment, a heavy weight pressing down on him. But beneath that weight, beneath the shame and the fear, a tiny seed of something new began to take root. A seed of understanding, a glimmer of empathy. He had a long way to go, a difficult journey ahead, but in the quiet recesses of his heart, Ethan knew that he had to change. He had to become someone better, someone worthy of respect, someone who wouldn't inflict pain on others. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He couldn't continue down the path he'd been on. The price was too high. The aroma of jasmine tea hung in the air, a fragile peace settling over the Adams home. The soft glow of the living room lamp painted long shadows on the walls, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged earlier. Mia sat curled on the sofa, a plush throw draped over her small frame. Her fingers traced the intricate patterns woven into the fabric, a quiet rhythm against the tumultuous beat of her heart. She had spoken, finally spoken. The words, once trapped in the cage of her fear, had finally found their flight, sharp and clear. A strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration washed over her. The exhaustion was a physical weight, settling deep in her bones. The exhilaration, a fragile butterfly fluttering in her chest, was the unfamiliar taste of empowerment. Jonathan Adams watched his daughter, his gaze heavy with a mixture of pride and pain. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she had shrunk into herself, trying to become invisible. The silence she had wrapped around herself like a shield. He had known, deep down, that the silence was not a choice but a necessity. Now, seeing the faint flicker of defiance in her eyes, he felt a surge of paternal protectiveness so fierce it almost choked him. He knelt beside her, the worn leather of the sofa creaking beneath his weight. "Not everyone would have handled that situation the way you did. That takes strength." "I guess," Mia murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign on her tongue, clumsy and inadequate. Inside, a whirlwind of emotions raged. She had been scared, terrified even. But beneath the fear, a different kind of strength had taken root, a strength born not of defiance, but of desperation. A cornered animal's last stand. She had never thought of herself as strong. Quiet, yes. Invisible often. but not strong. Across town, in the opulent silence of the Carter residence, Ethan sat rigidly on the edge of his bed. The plush carpet beneath his feet felt like shifting sand. His parents' voices, sharp and accusatory, echoed in his ears, a discordant symphony of disappointment and barely concealed anger. The shame burned in his throat, a bitter taste he couldn't swallow. He had never faced consequences like this before. He had always been shielded, protected by a wall of privilege and parental indulgence. He had grown accustomed to the power he wielded over others, the intoxicating thrill of fear in their eyes. Mia's face, etched with a newfound resolve, flashed before him. He hadn't expected her to fight back. He hadn't expected the quiet girl, the one he'd tormented for so long, to find her voice. And the consequences he'd never imagined they could be so real. The expulsion, the disappointed faces of his parents, the chilling silence that now hung in his home. It was a silence far more terrifying than any shouting. He closed his eyes, wishing he could rewind time, erase the smirk from his face, the cruel words that had tumbled from his lips. Back at the Adams residence, Jessica Adams sat across from Mia, her hand resting gently on her daughter's knee. She had listened to Mia's account of the incident, her heart clenching with each recounted detail. The anger she felt towards Ethan and his parents was a white-hot flame, but she forced herself to remain calm, focusing instead on her daughter's well-being. She saw a flicker of something new in Mia's eyes, a spark of resilience that had been absent before. It was a fragile spark, easily extinguished, but it was there, and Jessica vowed to nurture it, to help it grow into a steady flame. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Speaking up takes courage." Mia looked at her mother, the warmth of her gaze a comforting balm against the lingering chill of fear. She had never spoken up before. She had always swallowed her fear, buried it deep within herself. But something had shifted inside her that day. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled her. She had found a voice, small and hesitant, but her own, and that, she realized, was a power all its own. Later that night, as Mia lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The fear, the anger, the strange sense of triumph. It was a confusing kaleidoscope of emotions. But amidst the confusion, a single thought emerged, clear and unwavering. She would not be silent anymore. Ethan, miles away, lay awake in the darkness of his room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He couldn't shake the image of Mia's face, the quiet strength in her eyes. He had seen a glimpse of himself in that moment, reflected back at him in the shattered fragments of his own cruelty. He had seen the monster he had become, and the realization sickened him. The shame, the guilt, the fear of the unknown, they were a heavy burden, far heavier than any punishment his parents could inflict. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that things would never be the same again. The events of that day reverberated through the hallowed halls of Westlake Academy, leaving an indelible mark on everyone involved. Principal Reynolds, shaken by the swift and decisive action of Jonathan Adams, finally understood the depth of his negligence. The whispers about Ethan Carter, once hushed and fearful, now echoed with open condemnation. Samantha, the girl who had stood up for Mia, felt a quiet sense of pride, a validation of her own courage. The incident, a small ripple in the seemingly placid waters of the prestigious school, had exposed the dark undercurrents of privilege and power, forcing a reckoning that had long been overdue. The lessons learned that day, though painful and profound, held the seeds of change, a promise of a future where silence would no longer be the price of peace.